Hello everyone. Today I will be sharing how I made a Bridgerton inspired dress using my mix and match Regency Dress pattern. Now this pattern is available as a downloadable PDF in my Etsy shop. And today I will be making the ball gown skirt variation. You can check out the other skirt variation videos down below. I will add a link so you can check them out. But the ball gown skirt is a great option if you want to utilize a fabric with a border design or print. I also think the ball gown skirt is pretty easy to put together and it only requires a few meters of fabric. Today I'm going to be making a dress that is like a creamsicle, something inspired by the pretty dresses that Kate and Edwina wear. I'm really excited to share this process with you, so let's get into it. First, I'm going to select and prepare my pattern pieces. I need to select the bodice, sleeve, and skirt style, and I have decided on the 3-dart bodice, the fitted sleeve, and the ball gown skirt. My mix and match Regency dress pattern does come with different bodice, sleeve, and skirt styles. That way you can mix and match the pattern pieces to create a unique dress. Now this pattern includes 3 bodice styles, 6 sleeve styles, and 4 different skirts to choose from. But again, I've decided on the 3-dart bodice, the fitted sleeve, and the ball gown skirt. After choosing my pattern pieces, I'm going to print the PDF on the correct paper size, A4 or US letter. And I'm going to make sure my scale is set to 100%. I also like to change my print margins to 0. After printing out the 3 PDFs, I like to check the measurement of the square on the first page to make sure the dimensions are correct. Then I begin trimming the margins as needed and taping the pages together to create a grid. Every PDF is going to create its own grid. For example, my bodice pattern is 8 pages, and the grid it creates is 4 pages across and 2 pages down for the total of 8. I also put together my fitted sleeve pattern, which is just 4 pages. And the pattern for my ball gown skirt is 35 pages. And creates a grid that is 7 pages across and 5 pages down for the total of 35 pages. After assembling my 3 PDFs into the grid of pages which makes the pattern, I then cut them to my selected size, which is size 38. The pattern is labeled by bust size in inches, so take your bust measurement around the fullest part of your bust, your apex, and use this measurement to choose your size. For example, I have approximately a 38-inch bust, so I chose size 38. If you're in between sizes or prefer a tighter fitting bodice, then you can test sizing down with a mock-up, which is exactly what I'm going to do next, make a mock-up. Making a mock-up is super important and I highly recommend it. If anything, please test the mock-up of the bodice pieces before cutting into your expensive dress fabric. Making a mock-up can save you possible heartbreak, and it's also a great chance to fine-tune the fit of the garment. For example, you could adjust the neckline or the darts, or you may wish for some more room at the center back if you're adding buttons. I have decided that I wish to lower the neckline of my bodice. I have lowered the neckline by about 3 centimeters at the center front, while being mindful of the 1 centimeter required for seam allowance. I created a mock-up, used marker to draw the lower neckline that I desired, and then used my ruler to transfer these measurements to the pattern and redraw the new neckline. Again, making sure to leave 1 centimeter for that seam allowance. And with that, all of my pattern pieces are ready. I have my ball gown skirt, my bodice front, my bodice side, my bodice back, and the fitted sleeve pattern. I have made this dress with both lavender lace and orange lace, and for both dresses I have used these materials. About 3.5 meters of lace with a width of 130 centimeters, 3.5 meters of cream satin with a width of about 140 centimeters, a half meter of cotton for interlining, a 35 centimeter zipper, and matching thread. I want to make a dress from the cream satin with an orange lace layer on top, so I need to be mindful of all of the pieces I need to cut out. So first I'm going to cut out all of my pattern pieces from this orange floral lace. Now my orange lace fabric does have a bordered edge, and I want to take advantage of that and have it at the bottom of my dress. So I open up my fabric to its full width and then fold it over so it's 2 layers, and then I place my big skirt pattern piece down on top, making sure it's on the fold of the fabric. And I'm essentially going to be cutting one very large rectangle, which will become the dress's skirt. Now this skirt only has one seam and it's in the center back, which is what makes it so great for fabric with a bordered edge. I will also check the length of the skirt and compare it to my measurements, measuring from my underbust to where I want the bottom edge of my skirt to end. Because the fabric has a finished bottom edge, I don't need to add any extra room for a hem. I also won't be able to trim the bottom edge later on, so I need to be pretty particular with the skirt's length. I recommend you measure from your underbust down to your ankle and compare this measurement to the skirt's length before cutting out your big skirt piece. After cutting out my big skirt piece, I then cut out 2 sleeve pieces, again taking advantage of that finished bordered edge. Then I cut out 1 bodice front on the fold, 2 bodice sides, and 2 bodice backs. And as I'm cutting everything out from my lace fabric, I'm trying to be particular and very careful with the placement of the flowers. Now that I have all of my pattern pieces cut out from my lace fabric, the next thing I'm going to do is cut out my satin pattern pieces. So I'm going to cut out 1 skirt piece on the fold, 2 bodice fronts on the fold, 1 will be for the outer layer and 1 is going to be used for lining, 4 bodice sides, 2 for the lining and 2 for the outer layer, and 4 bodice backs, 2 for the lining and 2 for the outer layer. And I did not cut my sleeve pattern piece from the satin because I want my sleeves to be see-through. A satin layer is not needed. I also cut out 1 bodice front on the fold, 2 bodice sides, and 2 bodice backs from plain white cotton fabric. This cotton layer is going to be used as interlining for my bodice's outer layer. So basically I'm going to be pinning these cotton pieces to the wrong side of my bodice front, side, and back pieces. Now adding a layer of cotton to the bodice as interlining is totally optional, but I highly recommend it. The cotton layer can help prevent warping around the neckline. It can also give the bodice and darts structure and shape, and it can help support any heavy skirts and embellishments you might wish to add. I also find the layer of cotton especially beneficial when working with slippery and lightweight fabrics like this poly satin. So to recap, here is everything I have cut out. 1 bodice front cut on the fold in plain white cotton for interlining, 2 bodice sides in plain white cotton for interlining, 2 bodice backs in plain white cotton for interlining, 1 skirt cut on the fold from lace, 1 bodice front cut on the fold from lace, 2 bodice sides in lace, 2 bodice backs in lace, and 2 sleeves in lace. 1 skirt cut on the fold from satin, 2 bodice fronts cut on the fold in satin, 4 bodice sides in satin, and 4 bodice backs in satin. Next, I'm going to draw the darts into my bodice cotton interlining layer and the satin lining layer. I'm using my bodice front pattern piece like a stencil and drawing the darts in place. And I am being quite naughty. I'm using a pen to draw the darts, but I recommend you use chalk or a disappearing fabric pen. After I have drawn the darts on my cotton interlining layer and the satin lining layer, I am now going to stack and baste together my bodice outer layer pieces. My bodice outer layer is going to be comprised of 3 layers. First, the cotton interlining layer for the structure, then the cream satin layer, and on top, the lace layer. So the bottom layer is going to be my cotton interlining layer, and I want the side with the darts drawn in to be facing down. Then on top of it, I stack my satin layer with the right side facing up, and on top of that, I stack my orange lace layer, again right side facing up. Then I carefully pin these 3 layers together to secure. After pinning, I then baste these 3 layers together. That way it is easier to work on them and sew them, and it's a good way to prevent any shifting as I'm sewing. I'm going to go around all of the edges, carefully basting them together, and after I have basted all of the edges together, I then baste the darts into the front of my bodice as well. To do this, I match the legs of the dart together and then I pin the dart in place. Then I can hand sew the dart. Basting the darts before I machine stitch them is a great way to make sure nothing shifts as I'm working on it, and it's also an opportunity for me to check the placement of the darts and make sure I like everything. And here's what my bodice outer layer looks like with all 6 darts basted into place and ready to be machine stitched. I also prepare my bodice side and back pieces for machine sewing, layering the 3 layers together, first the cotton interlining, then the satin, and on top the lace. I then pin these 3 layers together and baste the edges to secure. And here you can see all of the outer layer pieces for my bodice, the bodice front, the 2 bodice sides, and the 2 bodice backs. I also have all of the pieces for my bodice lining. Again, the bodice front, the 2 bodice sides, and the 2 bodice backs. So now I can start machine sewing these pieces together. First, I use my machine to sew the darts into my bodice, starting from the bottom of the dart and stitching upwards, tapering off the bodice as I sew. You can tie the thread ends to secure. And I repeat this for all 6 darts on my bodice outer layer, and again for the 6 darts for my bodice lining. Next, I can attach my bodice back to the bodice side, matching these curved edges together with right sides facing one another and pinning. After pinning, I stitch with 1 centimeter of seam allowance. Then I trim the seam allowance and finish the raw edge with a zigzag stitch. Now when pinning and sewing these curved edges, work slowly. These can be a little tricky to match together, so sometimes it needs a little extra time and care when matching and pinning. And then I just repeat this for the other side of my bodice, again matching the bodice side to the bodice back with right sides facing one another. I pin the curved edges together and then stitch with 1 centimeter of seam allowance, trim the seam allowance, and then finish the raw edge with a zigzag stitch. And now my bodice side has been joined to my bodice back. The next thing to do is join my bodice side to my bodice front. I'm going to match my bodice side to my bodice front along the straight side edges with right sides facing one another and pinning together. I also match the shoulder strap edges together with right sides facing. So I pin the bodice front to the bodice back at both the top shoulder edge and that side edge. Then I stitch both the side seam and that shoulder seam, first with a straight stitch, then I trim the seam allowance and finish the raw edge with a zigzag stitch. Afterwards, I like to give my bodice a good press with an iron. I like to press all of my seams and darts towards the back. And then I'm going to repeat all of the previous steps to create my bodice lining. First, I baste and stitch the darts in place, then I stitch the bodice front to the bodice side, and I stitch the bodice side to the bodice back, and I stitch the top shoulder edges of the bodice front to the bodice back together. And I also finish all of the edges with a zigzag stitch. So now I have one complete bodice for the outside layer and one for the lining. You can also see the subtle difference adding that cotton interlining layer makes. So now the next thing we can do is make the sleeves. For the sleeves, I'm just going to fold them in half and match the side edges together and pin, with right sides facing each other. I stitch the side with 1 centimeter of seam allowance, then trim the seam allowance and finish with a zigzag stitch. I'm also going to skip adding the line of gathering stitches to the sleeve head since I don't want to tear the mesh. Now I can set the sleeve into the armhole of the bodice. I'm going to start by matching the side seam of my bodice to the side seam of my sleeve and pinning these points together. And then working up either side of the sleeve, I'm going to pin the sleeve flat and smooth into the armhole of the bodice. And I'm going to match and pin as I work up both sides of the armhole, again starting from that side seam and working my way up towards the top shoulder area. And I also want to pin my sleeve into the bodice with right sides facing each other. Now at the top of the shoulder, around that shoulder seam area and over top my shoulder, I'm going to create small gathers at the sleeve head to fit that extra volume into the armhole of the bodice. I'm going to pin a few small gathers into the armhole, creating them by hand. Then the entire sleeve should be set and pinned into the bodice. Again, the lower armpit area should be set smoothly and flush against the bodice, and at that top shoulder area is where all of the gathers are focused. Next, I take it to the machine and stitch it into place. As I stitch, I take care when sewing over top the gathers, and I stitch around the entire armhole, securing the sleeve to the bodice. After stitching, I trim the seam allowance and finish it with a zigzag stitch. And as an added detail, I press the seam allowance towards the inside of my bodice and top stitch it down, stitching the seam allowance down around the entire armhole of the bodice. I am sewing very carefully around the armhole since I do not want to break a needle, and my machine is sewing through quite a lot of layers. Now this isn't required, but it is a detail I liked because my sleeves are lace and I just don't want that seam allowance to be visible. Now one sleeve has been added to the bodice, so I repeat these steps for my other sleeve. I start by matching the side seam of the sleeve to the side seam of the bodice with right sides together and pin. I pin working up either side of the sleeve, pinning it smooth and flush into the bodice. I gather down the remaining volume of the sleeve head to fit it into the armhole and pin it in place. Once the sleeve is entirely pinned into the armhole, I then stitch it in place, sewing carefully over top the gathers and going around the entire armhole. I trim the seam allowance and finish the raw edge with a zigzag stitch. Then I press and top stitch the seam allowance towards the bodice. And here's how my bodice looks with both sleeves set into the armhole. You can see the bit of gathers at the top of the shoulder and the stitching around the armhole to secure the seam allowance down. Now that my bodice is ready and my lining, the next thing I'm going to do is sew up my skirt so I can attach it to my bodice. First off, I'm going to sew all the raw edges of my satin and lace layer with a zigzag stitch, just finishing those raw edges. So I zigzag around my top, bottom, and side edges of my satin, and I zigzag the top and sides of my lace, just to finish off the edges and prevent unraveling. Next, I'm going to fold my skirt piece in half down the center front and pin the back edges together with right sides touching. And I'm going to create a center back seam, but I want to leave the top 15 centimeters unsewn because I need to leave a little room for a zipper later on. So I measure down 15 centimeters from the top edge and then pin the remaining side back edges together. Then I sew this back seam and press the back seam open. I also press back the edges of that 15 centimeters portion that I left unsewn. And I'm going to repeat this for my lace layer, matching the back edges together and pinning with right sides facing each other. But for my lace layer, I like to start pinning from the bottom edge and work my way upwards, pinning the back edges together. because I want to keep that bottom edge lined up perfectly. And here you can see that portion of 15 centimeters left open for the zipper, which I'm not going to sew up. And after pinning the center back edges together, I sew up that back seam. Now the reason I have sewn the back seam of the lace and the satin skirt separately is because I think it looks a lot nicer when the lace layer is separate from the satin layer. That way the lace layer can sit on top of the satin and it moves more freely. So I like to sew these back seams separate and then stack the two skirts together. And that's what I'm going to do next. Stack my lace skirt on top of my satin skirt and pin the top waist edges together. I start by matching the center front points together and then working around the entire top edge. I match and pin the two layers together. I want the right side of my satin facing the wrong side of my lace. That way both right sides are visible when worn. As I'm working around the entire top edge, matching the lace to the satin, I want to be very gentle. The net of the lace can be stretched, so I don't want to pull it too hard and then pin it unevenly. I'm also going to match the edges of my center back together, matching that 15 centimeter portion for my zipper. After pinning the waist edges together, you can baste these top edges together by hand if you like. Next, I'm going to sew these two layers together with a straight stitch on the longest length. This stitch is going to act as both a basting stitch, keeping the two layers together, and as a gathering stitch. You can sew two separate rows of stitching, one for basting and one for gathering if you like, but I'm just going to sew the one. Now I'm going to sew entirely across the top edge of the skirts, securing them together. I will also take a quick moment and baste my two back edges together, that 15 centimeter portion I left unsewn at the center back of my skirt. And now I can attach my skirt to my bodice. First, I find the center front of my bodice and skirt, and I place a pin at these center front points to mark them. Then I match these two center front points together and pin. I want the right side of my skirt to face the right side of my bodice. Now I can gather down either side of my skirt and match it and pin it to my bodice. I'm going to gently pull the threads on my gathering line of stitches to gather down that top waist edge of my skirt. That way it's the same length and can fit onto the bodice. I'm going to be gentle as I pull the threads and massage the gathers into place, because I do not want to snap the thread. And I'm going to gather down from both sides of my skirt and try my best to keep the gathers pretty evenly spaced. Then I'm going to pin the skirt to the bodice, matching the waist edges together and leaving 1 centimeter ungathered at that center back so I can add my zipper later on. And here you can see how the dress looks at this point, with the top waist edge of my skirt gathered down and pinned to my bodice all along that waist edge, again with right sides together. Next, I'm going to sew the skirt to the bodice, making the waist seam. And as I sew this waist seam, I'm going to go very slow and be very careful because I want to make sure my gathers are sitting correctly. Then I pressed my seam allowance up towards my bodice and top stitched it down in place, sewing along that waist seam, securing the seam allowance down in place. And as I did this, I worked very slowly so I did not break a needle because it's a little bulky at this point. Now the top stitching was just an extra detail that I opted for, but it's not necessary. Now is a great point if you like to add the zipper into the center back of your dress. However, I'm personally going to hold off for a little bit and add my zipper after I add my lining because I think I want to hand sew it into the back of my dress. But of course, now is a great time to add the zipper if you choose to do so, and you can hide it partially with the lining. And now the lining is ready to be added to the dress. I start by matching the lining to the bodice outer layer at the center front with right sides together. I pin the center front points together and then match and pin all other key points together, like the center back edges and the shoulder seams. And I pinned the lining to the bodice all around the neckline and the center back edge. Next, I stitched my lining to my bodice, sewing around the entire neckline and the center back edges. After sewing, I clipped the seam allowance and the corners of my seam allowance to make turning right side out easier. As I clip, I take care not to cut through my line of stitching. Then I turn the bodice right side out and press the neckline and the center back with an iron. Next, I fold the seam allowance of my lining inwards and pin it down. I pin all along the waistline on the inside of the dress as well as the armholes. Then I can stitch by hand the lining to the seam allowance of the outer layer of my bodice. By turning the edges of my lining inwards and stitching it to the inside of my bodice's outer layer, I can create a very tidy finished inside to my garment. Again, I just want my hand stitching to catch the seam allowance of my bodice's outer layer. Now this can be a little time consuming at points, but I think it makes for a very lovely finished result. At this point, I also decided I wanted to pin my zipper into the center back of my dress and stitch it in by hand. I just pinned it in place and then hand stitched it. Now I could have added my zipper before my lining, as this would have made for a tidier result and the zipper would have been partially hidden underneath the lining. But I was a little worried about tearing the net, so I chose to hand sew it so I could have a little more control over it. Now from the inside of the dress, the zipper looks just so, but from the outside I think it looks pretty nice. You could add your zipper and then add the lining for a cleaner finished look, or opt for a totally different back closure, like adding buttons, hooks and eyes, ribbon ties, or eyelets for a corset style back. This is totally up to you. I just recommend you test it out with a mock-up first. Now the last thing I'm going to do is finish the bottom edge of my skirt satin layer with a simple rolled hem. The lace has a lovely decorative edge, so it does not need to be hemmed, but the satin layer underneath needs a quick finish. So I fold the bottom edge up 2 times and stitch it down in place so that the raw edge is completely hidden, and then I give it a quick press with an iron. And with that, my orange ball gown is finished, and it reminds me of a creamsicle. I've also made a similar dress from a cream satin with a lavender lace that I quickly want to share with you. This lavender lace ball gown has a 2-dart bodice, fitted sleeves, and the same ball gown style of skirt. I think the ball gown skirt and the fitted sleeves work very well with bordered fabric because of those straight edges. For the lavender version, I used a light blue cotton for the interlining and stacked on top of it a cream poly satin and the lavender lace. And the process for making the lavender version is much the same. The only big difference between the two is that the lavender version has a bodice with 2 darts and the orange version has a bodice with 3 darts. Both the lavender and the orange dresses are very pretty and remind me of many different gowns from Bridgerton. The ball gown skirt may be a great option if you are looking to utilize a border print or design. And now I'm very excited to share with you how these 2 dresses look when worn. And thank you so much for watching this video. If you like this video and would like to see more fun DIY videos and more videos where I make Bridgerton inspired dresses, then definitely like and subscribe. Thank you. Bye.